And what's the one reason you're going to do something for me without me asking you to? It's going to make your life better.
Yeah.
It's going to make you look cool. So very, very often we spend too much time when we're trying to come up with something, focusing on like how we're going to make it cool, look cool and make ourselves look cool. But we don't focus enough time on how is this going to make somebody else look cool when they share it.
Yeah.
But even if you have both of those things, you will still be in trouble if people can't actually remember the idea and
Yeah.
the concept. So the way I like to break it down is if you want people to remember you more, you focus on less. And that's language, emotion, simplicity, and structure.
Ah,
So
okay.
language starts out because if you have your own language for things, basically you have carved out a piece of mental real estate for people,
Hmm.
right? If they will attribute that word to you, that idea to you. And this is the reason why we study Shakespeare, and very, very few of us ever study Christopher Marlowe, because Shakespeare added new words to the English language,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Emotion, whenever we're in heightened states of emotion, our brains become like a sponge. So we actually remember more detail. And this is one of the core reasons why you'll see any number of TED Talks or presentations open with some kind of emotional story, some personal story of the individual, because our brains basically then become wired. We're in that emotional state. We're ready to hear whatever the concept is, we're ready to hear whatever the idea is. And the simplest way I can explain this is you ask anybody what the opening scenes are of Titanic and nobody can tell you.
Yeah.
But you ask that same group of people which image comes into their head when you say, I'll never let go, and
Yeah.
they can instantly tell you,
Yeah. Exactly.
right? They can see it right away.
Yep.
So then you have simplicity. And over the years, academics has always rewarded complexity. When we were in school, it was the best thing to write the biggest papers, to use the biggest words. And that carries over so often into our marketing. We try to sort of impress people with all the big words we use, with all the big things we say. But the memory rewards simplicity because there's only so much information that people can hold. So you have to think about how are you going to make this so simple that somebody else can share it and talk about it? And that leads to the last point, which is structure. Our brains process information if it's in a structure. If something comes first, second, last, like that's what we look for, right? So if you don't give people a structure to understand the information, they are far less likely to remember it and they're far less likely to share it because we don't want to look awkward in front of our friends. We don't want to say, like, I think this comes first, but then I think this thing comes second, but maybe this is the other thing. We want to look competent and confident, right, in our explanations of concepts. So, what I often will do with clients is I'll take a look at each of these aspects in their life, and I have a bunch of frameworks to help them sort of assess like where their accessibility is, what's happening on the influence side, what's happening on the memory side, and we'll reshape or reposition a particular offering that they have, or just develop one of these innovative frameworks for them. It was hectic. I think it's probably the best the best description. I have a younger sister, so it was my mom, my dad, me, and my younger sister Jenny, and it was usually like let's kind of uh, get to eating as soon as possible so that we can all go on with the things that
Yeah.
we've got.
Whatever's going on. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. That we've got that we've got next. So yeah, so it was always kind of like a very, very quick sort of stop in the day, if you will, when I start to kind of think back to what it was like.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. So, did you have any like entrepreneurial tendencies growing up, or were you exposed to entrepreneurialism or anything like that?
A little bit. I collected comic books,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of like buying and selling and stuff that happened kind of in that sort of collectible
Mhm.
world.
Mhm.
But I would say I probably didn't start doing anything entrepreneurial till probably about high school. And in high school, I had an idea to do a fundraiser for our school's English department. So I actually put together a whole Battle of the Bands evening with my
Oh,
band
cool.
at the time. We had we were the headliners, and yeah, it was a lot of fun, and that was kind of the first, I would say probably my first foray into doing anything entrepreneurial.
Yeah. What kind of music did you guys play?
So it was very much a mix. So we had some songs that were kind of like Rage Against the Machine-esque,
Okay.
where there was a lot of like, rapping kinds of sounds. But we also had a couple that were very much in that sort of alternative kind of sounded like Nirvana
Yeah. Yeah.
type of sound as well.
Love it. It's my generation. Love that music. It's great.
Yeah.
So so did you go to school? Did you go to college? Did you
Yep.
do that part of it?
Yeah, I got my for undergrad I did a double major. So I was secondary at English and theater performance. So I studied first to be an English teacher at the secondary level, the high school level, and I also did a full theater performance major. So I actually ended up doing what they call the victory lap, where because I double majored, even with overloading credits, I still had an additional year that I had to just sort of like rack up all the credits and get everything that I needed to graduate.
Very cool. Very cool. So after you graduated, what was, your next step? Did you go into the corporate world? Or did you jump right into starting your own companies? What did that next step look like?
So it was going into the world of teaching, actually. I got a call from a friend of mine, and he was teaching at an all boys Catholic high school on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I also got a call from a friend of mine uh, who had told me that my old high school was hiring. was hiring. So I applied for both. I took a trip to New York and interviewed with LaSalle, which was the school that I taught at, and then I also interviewed with my old high school. And I got offered both jobs on the same day. I was directing a show, and I had an intermission for the show that I was directing, and I checked both my voicemails, and one was my old high school saying, "We'd love to have you in for the final sort of round of interviews," and LaSalle here in New York. And I basically I talked to a bunch of my friends about, well, what do I do, and a number of them said, well, here in Rhode Island, you're a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
Everybody knows you. You can sort of do whatever you want. Um, so, in New York, you're probably not going to know a lot of people. So I decided, you know what? That's fine with me. I'm just going to go for it. And I left Rhode Island to get a teaching job here in the city, starting in 2002 in a school on the Lower East Side. So my sophomores, who were my first group, were freshmen the prior year, and were there on basically on the highest level of the school during 9/11.
Yeah.
So it
Wow.
was fascinating to just kind of see the difference in just what their experience was. I was when I was in grad school, I did a number of theater projects, and one of those projects was an ethnodrama where I interviewed my students about their experiences of 9/11. I called it Nine Students, 11 Questions, and we had them sort of present their stories, and we did a whole big performance of it.
Wow. That's cool. That's very cool.
Yeah.
So out of college, when was the first time when you really started your first company? Was it the one you're in now, or did you have a couple of other things that you went through first?
I had a couple of other ventures. I had Small Pond Entertainment before I had Small Pond Enterprises, and Small Pond Entertainment was basically just a theater company. So I was still teaching high school, and I basically just started raising money for sort of smaller projects. So the 25,000, budgets that you usually have for like a 99 seat and under theater,
Yeah.
or a project of that nature. So I learned while that was all going on, I was in grad school. that a lot of the students at NYU, they had donors who were willing to help them fund the projects, but they didn't necessarily have anybody who could help them actually run the projects,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I sort of jumped in and I ran Small Pond Entertainment for a number of years, basically on more of the sort of helping them produce, sort of being that general manager, if you will, of theater productions and projects. And it wasn't until after I had sort of gotten to the Broadway producer level that a lot of people started asking me, how did you do this? And that's really what led to the second aspect of the business, which really was in the relationship building space. So
Mhm.
I was just asked all the time, how did you get to these, sort of next levels? And I would host these workshops where I would simulate networking experiences. So to have people act out everything from one-on-one meetings to job interviews to cocktail parties. Ran a conference for a number of years called ConnectorCon, where I brought connectors together from all sorts of different industries. So there was a whole stint of time where I was more in sort of like it was almost like an events business kind of thing. I even for a couple of years, I even hosted a scavenger hunt that was all over New York City that was
Wow.
combined with a networking event.
Very cool. Very cool. So when did you start Small Pond Enterprises, and what prompted you to start that?
Yeah, so small pond enterprises really came from the fact that I was giving lots of advice to people, and I was just like always just kind of meeting with them and just sort of helping them, and they'd ask me to go out for coffee or whatnot. And eventually, I sort of hit this point where people were like, "I would pay you to give me this advice. Like, if you could, sort of do this, like." I would pay you to coach me or sort of work
Mhm.
with me on this.
Mhm.
So that's when I really started to kind of figure out, oh, okay, there are models out there that you can do this kind of work. So I started to study more of the marketing side of things, more of the copywriting side of things, really started to learn all the things that you learn about building a permission base, selling to that permission base, all of those early stage, elements that you start with when you're developing a coaching business.
Very cool. Very cool. So who is your target type person that you typically are, consulting or advising?
Yeah. So these days it's very different. It started out where it was mostly people in the networking space, but probably about 4 years ago, I noticed that space was starting to not only get very crowded, but also get very sketchy. There were just a lot of people trying to sell people on this idea that, if you pay me X amount of dollars, I'll teach you how to meet famous people and then you'll be rich, was sort of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
general sort
Yeah.
of thing. So I was like, I didn't want to be part of that world. So I had a moment where I said, okay, if I took networking out of the equation, what still got me into all the rooms that I got into? And I realized it was because people would talk about me when I wasn't in the room in a good way.
Mhm.
So I was teaching one of my workshops and I took 15 minutes for a theory. And I basically said, I have a theory that if you can become more referable, if you can create a referable brand for yourself, that will start to kind of do the work for you. And people will just start coming to you. People will trust your work more. You'll be able to just attract the audience that you want to attract. And I gave, a couple of ideas of ways that I thought somebody could do this. So I get to the end of that workshop and I ask everybody what they want their hot seats to be on, and everybody says referable brand.
Okay.
So I shifted gears and I started to focus on helping thoughtful givers become thought leaders. So usually people are very good at giving and supporting and doing things for their clients are the ones who are the most likely to deprioritize the packaging of
Yeah.
their intellectual property. They never sit down and come up with what is their innovative framework. They know their why, but they don't know their if,
Yeah.
right? Their innovative framework, their thing that they can present to people and sort of, make that happen. So I now come in as sort of a mix between Malcolm Gladwell and Don Draper for these folks and help them move into thought leadership. I help them package those ideas. I help them figure out where they're going to focus, how they're going to focus. And most of the work I end up doing is with other folks in the coaching and consulting space. But I've certainly over the years had some people in the startup world, some people in the tech world, all the different places.
Yeah, yeah. So what is your teaching, your training look like? Is it a bunch of frameworks, or is there software involved, or how do you deliver that message, or that training, I guess?
Sure, sure. So there are main frameworks that I have that I use, and then I sort of have a bunch of other things that are kind of almost like a toolbox when people are struggling with certain issues. So the main framework of referability focuses around the idea of accessibility, influence, and memory. Easy to remember because it spells the word aim. Right. So the first thing that you always have to think about if you want your idea to be referable is it accessible? Can people outside of your industry understand what you're talking about, or are you in what I like to refer to as the echo chamber of the enlightened, where
Yeah,
everybody's sort of patting themselves on the back and saying that's great, but they don't actually understand. They all understand what's going on, but everybody on the outside is like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
yeah,
So that's
yeah,
usually your first hurdle. But your second hurdle is influence. And most of the time when we think about influence, we think about it in the context of persuasion because that's most of the content that's out there.
hmm,
But if I have true influence, you do things without me asking you to. And what's the one reason you're going to do something for me without me asking you to? It's going to make your life better.
yeah,
It's going to make you look cool. So very, very often we spend too much time when we're trying to come up with something focusing on like how we're going to make it cool, look cool and make ourselves look cool. But we don't focus enough time on how is this going to make somebody else look cool when they share it.
yeah,
But even if you have both of those things, you will still be in trouble if people can't actually remember the idea and
yeah,
the concept. So the way I like to break it down is if you want people to remember you more, you focus on less. And that's language, emotion, simplicity, and structure.
ah,
So
okay,
language starts out because if you have your own language for things, basically you have carved out a piece of mental real estate for people,
hmm,
right? If they will attribute that word to you, that idea to you. And this is the reason why we study Shakespeare, and very, very few of us ever study Christopher Marlowe, because Shakespeare added new words to the English language,
hmm,
right?
hmm,
Emotion, whenever we're in heightened states of emotion, our brains become like a sponge. So we actually remember more detail. And this is one of the core reasons why you'll see any number of TED Talks or presentations open with some kind of emotional story, some personal story of the individual, because our brains basically then become wired. We're in that emotional state. We're ready to hear whatever the concept is, we're ready to hear whatever the idea is. And the simplest way I can explain this is you ask anybody what the opening scenes are of Titanic and nobody can tell you.
yeah,
But you ask that same group of people which image comes into their head when you say, I'll never let go, and
yeah,
they can instantly tell you,
yeah, exactly.
right? They can see it right away.
Yep.
So then you have simplicity. And over the years, academics has always rewarded complexity. When we were in school, it was the best thing to write the biggest papers, to use the biggest words. And that carries over so often into our marketing. We try to sort of impress people with all the big words we use, with all the big things we say. But the memory rewards simplicity because there's only so much information that people can hold. So you have to think about how are you going to make this so simple that somebody else can share it and talk about it? And that leads to the last point, which is structure. Our brains process information if it's in a structure. If something comes first, second, last, like that's what we look for, right? So if you don't give people a structure to understand the information, they are far less likely to remember it and they're far less likely to share it because we don't want to look awkward in front of our friends. We don't want to say, like, I think this comes first, but then I think this thing comes second, but maybe this is the other thing. We want to look competent and confident, right, in our explanations of concepts. So what I often will do with clients is I'll take a look at each of these aspects in their life. And I have a bunch of frameworks to help them sort of assess like where their accessibility is, what's happening on the influence side, what's happening on the memory side, and will reshape or reposition a particular offering that they have, or just develop one of these innovative frameworks for them.
Okay. So what types of results have you seen people get after going through, your frameworks or your exercises?
Yeah, so it really, as with a lot of these types of things, it varies based on their goals and sort of what they're working on. But I've had instances where people have been selling something for a few $100s and been able to sell that exact same thing for a few thousand.
Wow.
And it's mainly because they've repositioned it, the language is different, and there is something that they've developed that people can trust, right? They can
Yeah.
trust that they're going to go through a process. So they tend to invest more as a result of that. I've also seen instances where when uh, different clients have used these frameworks that they've developed on things like podcasts or other interview scenarios, they get asked by other people to be on their show, or they get approached more often because those ideas are sort of stuck in the memory. And then I would say probably the most important thing is the they could be in an industry where there's tons of other people also working in that same industry and offering the same thing, but they almost never get asked about how are you better than this person or that person, because they have such a specific thing
Yeah.
that they do that the other person just is either really attracted to it or doesn't feel it's a fit and moves on.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's sort of a self-filtration process there, if you will. So
Yeah.
interesting. So I mean, obviously we're on a podcast right now. I'm curious, is there anything that we can go into like, quickly where I don't know, I feel strange like using past the secret sauce,
Yeah.
but is there anything that sort of comes to mind that we can sort of talk through as to, maybe this is wrong or and again, we could use past the secret sauce or any of your clients that come to mind.
Sure.
I'm just curious to be able to extract sort of the, that shift in a real world scenario as to, it was this and then it turned into this, just to give an example of, that
Sure.
transformation.
Yeah, so I mean, we can look at. So first, we would say, okay, from the standpoint of past the secret sauce, let's just start with accessibility.
Mhm.
Do you feel like people understand the concept of the show, what the show is, what the show is doing? Do people get it sort of right away?
So I think that they do, like everybody is attracted to that because you hear the secret sauce over and over, like I want the secret sauce, right?
Hmm.
So the concept is there, but they may not necessarily understand what context the secret sauce is giving, or
Hmm.
what is the secret sauce that I'm consuming. Everybody sort of understands, okay, I'm going to get some type of secret, or some type of information, but I may not necessarily understand what that information is pertaining to or what
Mm.
have you. So,
So what may be happening is that you've got a attention grabbing title,
mhm,
right? You have something that can sort of get people to be like, oh yeah, that's interesting. But once they're kind of interested, the question is, where is the value for me? Right? So what
yeah,
is the subtitle of the show that causes somebody to say, oh, this is totally for me. This
yeah,
is what, this applies to. And when we see that subtitle, a lot of the time it helps us understand, oh, this show is going to help me with this. This show is going to help me figure out this problem or this challenge, et cetera. So the first question would be, do you have a subtitle that
yeah.
you use for the show?
That's true. I don't have a subtitle. We have the description, which you have to go. Essentially, I think it's on the, show number one. That was launched a year ago now.
Hmm.
So nobody really goes back, all the way through. They're just going to see whatever the new episodes are. So the titles of each one of the episodes sort of give that away, because each one of the titles is, obviously catered to whatever the topic might be. So you can kind of get an idea as to what I'm going to learn in this particular episode. And obviously, all the episodes are all sort of all over the place. But entrepreneurialism is sort of the core concept or core idea behind it.
Yeah. So ultimately, what you want to do if let's say you're going to try to come up with a subtitle, right,
Mhm.
is to think about what the show is doing for people. I call it giving yourself an F, right? So most of the time, what we do is we try to sort of explain to people what we do. And the best way to get their interest is to talk about what we do for, right?
Okay.
So what you would do is you would look at the show and say, what does this show do for the entrepreneur?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you'd start to craft a subtitle or a piece of language that talks about what that actually is, right? So it would be, a podcast for the podcast for entrepreneurs who want to blank,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And one of the best ways to, again, strip this of the jargon, right? Because it's very easy to start throwing in a bunch of, random words and making it very bold, like, just overloading it, is to ask a couple of very simple questions. So, easiest one is you want to do at least one of these three things, otherwise, you'll be sad in your
Okay.
business. And
Okay.
that's solve a problem, alleviate pain, or decrease friction.
Okay.
So you want to ask, how does this show solve a problem for
Okay.
the entrepreneur? How does it get rid of a pain that they're experiencing? And then finally, how does it take something that normally takes a long time and shorten that cycle,
Yeah.
right?
I like that.
Make it so that there's less friction. Thank you.
I like that.
Um, the other aspect of it is every single person, no matter who you're meeting, no matter who you're talking with, has an index. I call it the TCM index, and that's an index of time, connections, and money.
Okay.
There's always a deficit in one of them for people, and usually the way to solve the problem is in examining the other two. So if you've got a deficit in money, it's directly tied to how you're spending your time and who you're connecting with. If you have a deficit in the types of connections that you want, it's directly tied to how you're spending your time and how you're spending your money. And if you have a deficit in time, it is directly tied to who you're interacting with and who you're hiring or who you're getting to do the work that you don't really need to be doing.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is, with your show, you can ask this question of how am I solving a problem for the entrepreneur in terms of time? How am I solving a problem for the entrepreneur in terms of their connections? How am I solving a problem for the entrepreneur in terms of money? And you can do the same thing with alleviating pain and decreasing friction. And you end up with about, I call it the jargon grid. You end up with about 9 different ways to describe what it is that you're doing. Well,
Hmm.
now you got a whole bunch of descriptions. So now you just can start to look at, okay, well, which of these descriptions is really compelling? And then you can create a sentence based on that description.
Very cool. Wow. That's amazing. I love that. You mentioned, so I also have a technology company too, and you mentioned, the one framework that kind of reminded me of something that we do when we're trying to extract how people are using their systems currently. So that is essentially you say, as the blank, I should blank so that I can blank. So
Hmm.
as the secretary, I should be able to look up the past clients so that I can answer the phone, phone conversations when they're calling in, asking about their account or something like that. So
Yep.
you just fill in that blank, and then you have, in our case, the feature request. But it's kind of very much so the same type of philosophy where you just use those frameworks to be able to fill in those blanks and come up with the exact same outcomes. I love that.
Exactly.
I love that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that is great. So all of the different acronyms and all of that,
Yep.
have you put all these together yourself and realized
Yes.
all these over the years? Wow,
Yeah.
wow, very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. After a while, what happens, and I've talked about this before, patterns are always the precursor to frameworks.
Hmm.
So when you start to notice something happening over and over and over again, after a while, you start to say, okay, what would be an easy way to explain this? What would be an easy way to break this down so that I'm not just saying the same thing over and over and over again? So eventually you sort of hit this point where you're just like, oh, well, it would spell this word. Or, oh, you can use this metaphor to sort of
Yeah.
translate the idea and sort of get people to understand it. And a lot of the time, one of the best ways to do this kind of work is to test it in front of other audiences, right?
Yeah,
I often refer to it as the playing the small clubs model, right? So comedians who are really, really great at their craft go to
yeah,
the clubs that are small and early and starting out, and they test jokes and they see like which ones really kill. And
yeah,
then they go and they do their big set, at the larger, at the larger thing. Well, it's the same thing for thought leadership. It's like you go and do interviews, you have conversations, and you look at like, when do people say, wow, that was really interesting, or oh, that was so useful, or oh, that was so helpful? And then you say, you know what, I'm going to keep that, or you say something and you get complete crickets. You say, okay, that's not really, that doesn't really work, so I'm going to just like table that and maybe try a different version of it.
I love that. I love that. That is great. What is, are there any industries, would you say, that your frameworks are better suited for than others? Or is this pretty well, is this pretty well open to, any industry?
Yeah, I would say referability in this main sort of overall framework really does end up fitting in any industry. I have often looked at, where have people been really successful and sort of
Mhm.
which titles or ideas have sort of just like really blown up. And when I look back at each of them, it's like I can trace these elements, right? You can see sort of these things in in these particular stories. So I don't think that there's any specific industry that's like, oh, this works way better.
Yeah,
I think it's more about the nuances of the industry and sort of where they lean. Like some industries are going to spend way more time on accessibility. And other industries are going to be spending way more time on influence, and other industries are going to be spending way more time on memory because they've figured out, that particular problem or that particular issue.
uh, yeah, that makes sense. If people want to learn more about you or your products, your services, where would you say is the best way to reach out and get in touch?
Yeah, so my website is just smallpondenterprises.com, and they can kind of see some of the stuff I've got there. But there's also if they go to myreferabilityrater.com, there's basically a test you can take to see how referable you are. So
Okay.
you can actually answer a bunch of questions about your accessibility, about your influence, about your memory, and it'll give you a breakdown, basically a score, in that regard. So if folks are really curious about that, they can go to myreferabilityrater.com, and then I'm all over the place on the socials. If you search me, you'll find me for sure.
I like the referability. So has technology played a big role in your company, would you say, or even your referral or consulting business?
I would say it's not like a massive role, but it definitely has enhanced it, right? So I write a daily email. So I write Monday through Friday, and a lot of the time, the technology that's out there, that tracks where people link to and like all of that
Yeah.
kind of stuff
Yep.
is enormously helpful, in that world. And the whole aspect of having a funnel and sort of knowing like this is when somebody clicked on this or where this thing went, like that kind of stuff is really, really great. I am a big fan of technology myself. I love looking at sort of how do we make things easier, right?
Yeah.
How do we make
Yeah.
things, simpler? So I definitely am one of those people like I my email, I use Superhuman, and like, I love the whole sort of like keystroke and like being, very, very simple, right? Like very, very, very clean. So yeah, I'm always looking at like what are those new technologies or interesting things that are out there for sure.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Michael, this has been really, really incredible. I'm going to go back and doodle down some of these exercises myself and go through what my thoughts are. Actually, I guess it's another question too. Do
Yeah.
you do this in? I mean, I'm assuming that you do this sort of one-on-one with people, but can this also be done in a group setting where you're kind of bouncing ideas off of one another and doing it in more of a workshop type setting, I guess you can say.
Yes, yeah, I've done a number of workshops before where either what I'll do is, let's say you have like a sales team or a biz dev team, you will take something like the jargon grid and it'll be a discussion about, okay, well, what is the company actually doing for everybody? And then
Yeah,
like, what language are we using? How are we going to describe this, or how are we going to talk, how are we going to talk about this? And in some cases, you have individuals on a team, and it's about like, well, which things do you want to own versus which things do other people not want to own? So when you really break down all the different ways that you're serving, you be like, oh, okay, you're going to be the person who's going to really kind of beat this drum, and you're going to be the person who's going to beat that drum, and you can really do a lot when you do it in a group, and sort of bring in all of those different thoughts and different
yeah.
ideas for sure.
Cool, cool. Well, last question too.
Yeah.
So you've named two companies, Small Pond something. Where did the
Yes.
Small Pond come from? What's the
It
the-
really came from that Rhode Island conversation, because when my friends had said, here you're a big fish in a small pond, nobody's going to know you. I said I'm going to go to New York and create my own small pond, and that's
uh,
what I did.
I love that. I love that. Michael, this has been fantastic. I certainly appreciate the time.
Yeah,
And I think you provided a hell of a lot of value today with with all the frameworks and explanations and all that. So this is going to be a good episode. Certainly
awesome.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem.